Okay, so I want to say a little bit more about this project that we're sort of gearing up for, the Great Migration. I want you to be thinking about how you might approach it. I want you to be thinking big picture, but also be thinking specifically. And so, this handout is supposed to help you, especially along the lines of thinking about specific main characters. Um, this is a primary source, right? These are letters written by people at the time period, so it's a good lens through which to examine this particular era of history, seeing, for example, what are the major concerns of these people that are going to be moving, right? You don't just wake up on a Monday and say, you know what, I'm going to leave the only place I've ever known and go a few thousand miles away, maybe among strangers, try to find a job and try to live. You don't just do that. Um, you usually have reasons for going. So demographers, sociologists, and others study population movements, and immigration in particular. They'll talk about push and pull factors, right? Pushing factors are things that are pushing people to want to leave, to consider leaving, sometimes literally pushing them out of their homeland. Many immigrants come to this country because they really don't have another choice. They may literally die if they stay where they are for, political reasons, religious reasons, what have you. Some are going to come seeking economic opportunity, right? And so this notion of the American dream that we've talked about, right? The possibility of improving yourself in one generation, right? That you don't have to die in the same class position that you were born in, right? Even if you were born poorest of the poor, right? There's possibilities there. We've referenced that several times. You could think about these folks along those lines. Also, that second part of the American dream that we keep coming back to, this sort of generational component, right? Maybe you can come find a job, and even if you have to work hard the rest of your life, maybe your children will have a better opportunity. That's, I think, a strong component to this dream and to this sort of migration story as well. So what better way to get a sense of what people are thinking as they even contemplate this move, which can be a very difficult move. You see some of the themes that come up in terms of their wanting to come. You see some of the obstacles they talk about to their coming, some of the difficulties they're having where they are. And again, we've seen a number of sources already that I think may come into this discussion and may influence this discussion. And we'll see even more that may be related to this whole movement of people and sort of uprooting oneself to try to seek something better. So these letters are interesting. You'll notice that they're written specifically in the language of the people at the time. So you may hear a Southern dialect, for example. They are very sort of real in terms of their goals, laying out their goals. And let me give you a little bit of context on some of these letters. Now, what happens in many African-American newspapers at the time, particularly the biggest ones like the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, there are others. There's one, you'll look at some, I have some sources from the Detroit newspaper. You have people that are writing letters seeking aid in migrating. They say, look, we want to come north. If you could help us, we'll come. All right, I'll bring myself, I'll bring my family. Some people are saying, look, I got 50 guys that are ready to come. We hear about all these factory jobs that you're advertising in the Chicago Defender and these other papers. If you can just get us a train ticket, we'll be there Monday, right? Folks are that willing to leave where they are. And again, for some of the reasons we've discussed. Think about what's happening in the South in particular around the turn of the century, right? We've talked extensively about lynching and racial violence. There's an economic downturn, right? There's the cotton crop is gone into the toilet essentially, right? So a lot of folks are leaving for that reason. Sharecropping is not the opportunity folks thought it was going to be. Voting rights are being taken away. Educational opportunities may be limited. So those may be some of the push factors. Some of the pull factors pulling people north. Industrialization, right? There's advertising for all these good factory jobs paying, $1 a day. When you're making $1 a week, $1 a day sounds great, right? Or if you can get a job in Henry Ford's Ford plant making $5 a day. I mean, this is fantastic, right? You can literally change your life. Ideas of racial equality being in the North. Again, we've seen how sometimes that's not always true, but at least the idea is there that the North may be this land of freedom, hope. So you see some of these things reflected in some of the letters here. What I want you to do is think specifically, though, think specifically about how these men and women, right, these were letters from both men and women, may indicate any number of things, right? Race may come into it, gender may come into it, class may come into it, Are men and women migrating for the same reasons? Sometimes they might be. Sometimes there might be other reasons that gender may come into these things. So I want you to think about the particular immigration story here and these main characters, but also how these specific stories illustrate larger ideas about the migration. I remember the overall question that I've sort of asked everybody to begin to respond to is ultimately whether this migration is going to be a good or a bad thing. Is it beneficial or detrimental? And that question seems easy on its surface, but maybe it's more complicated than we might think. That's kind of the starting point. Let's see where we end up. This is essentially kind of doing history rather than just reading about it and learning about it. And in many ways, this is the best way to learn about it is by doing it. What you're doing is taking these specific stories and relating them to the larger idea of the migration itself. So again, these are letters being written particularly to African-American newspapers, and they're asking for help, they're asking for assistance. Many of these newspapers had been advertising for people to come north. They're saying, look, leave Mississippi, come to Chicago. Right? We got all these meatpacking jobs. Or New York, come here. Right? It's going to lead to things like a Harlem Renaissance, for example, in the same era. Come to Pittsburgh, the steel mills are hiring. Right? So then these folks are writing. You can see some of the things that they actually are going to write. This is the same as the document in the Great Migration Project folder, 7 letters from the Great Migration. That's this one right here. I just printed it out and gave it to you. Some of the other documents that are here that I did not print out are summaries, an overview kind of outline. There's a couple of websites. There's UMBC has some information. The Schomburg has a website on the Great Migration. So all this stuff is going to be available for you. There are some more primary documents in this Holt, Major Problems, Chapter 4. I'll probably print a page or two of this and bring it the next time we meet. This is the Warmth of Other Suns interview that we watched, listened to, last time, and this is the first handout. So in terms of these letters, you see the first part is just a summary. Right? It says between 1916 and 1921, 500,000 African Americans left the South and journeyed to cities in the North and West, in what was then the largest internal movement of people in such a concentrated period of time in the history of the nation. So that's only really the first 5 years of this larger migration. There are really several waves of the Great Migration. People are going to move, especially during World War I, this period, and immediately after, and they're going to keep coming. And they come again, even larger numbers during World War II. So again, as we move further in our own studies, we'll see how the history here is really a 50, 60-year period of people moving, ultimately to the toll of about 6 million people. But this first wave that they're referencing here is 1916 and 1921, and about 500,000, 500,000 people will leave the South in that period. Migrants' letters to northern newspapers were among the best and most voluminous sources for understanding the migration process and interpreting the migrants' motivations for leaving. I want you to think about the motivations. Why are people leaving? That will help you then answer the question, when they arrive, do they find what they were looking for? They come looking for something. Are they going to find what they're looking for? If not, maybe you argue that the movement itself was a bad idea. Maybe it was detrimental. If they do find what they're looking for, in your opinion, then maybe you argue that it's beneficial. Right? I want you to think about this bigger question, but look at it specifically through sort of the eyes of some individuals. I'm going to keep pushing you to be specific because this is a huge topic. Right? Isabel Wilkerson writes a whole book on it. I'm not asking you to write a whole book. I'm asking you to really take a small slice. So some of the ways to do that, to be specific while still thinking about the big picture, are to focus on a main character, or at least to use that main character to sort of introduce your argument. You don't have to tell me everything about your character, right? These letters, for example, are fairly brief. You don't know everything about the character. You don't even know many of their names. But they still can serve as characters for you to kind of introduce your subject to help you answer that question. That's one way to be specific, is speaking through the character. A second way that I'm going to push you to be specific is to try to consider one particular immigration stream. For example, there are going to be direct connections between, say, Mississippi, the Mississippi Delta, and Chicago. Right? So I can give you an example. An outgrowth of this is going to be the Chicago blues, jazz. My folks come from New Orleans, Mississippi, and going there, taking their instruments with them. Right? So we are going to see some longer-term implications of this. That might be one stream you want to look at. this many people go from, to Chicago in this period. Chicago is transformed, becomes this major metropolis, blah, blah, blah. People coming to New York might be another stream you look at, which is going to be a massive stream. I'll give you some statistics on numbers of people and things down the road, and some of them are in this whole document, Chapter 4, Major Problems. There's some statistics on how these cities grow in this period that may be helpful for you. A city like Washington, D.C. receives plenty of migrants. Baltimore receives plenty of migrants, folks leaving from the deeper south and coming northward. Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, any number of cities that may interest you. So keep these two specifics in mind: what main character and what immigration stream sort of speaks to you the most. Use those two to help you make a larger argument about answering this question about the migration more generally. All right, so in terms of where you get your main characters from, there are a lot of choices. One of these could be a character. If one strikes you, you'll see some people in the visual sources I want to show you. There may be somebody in the textbook. Some of our discussions. Jack Johnson is a migrant. Right? He comes from Galveston, Texas. Ends up in mostly Chicago and other places, but really centers in Chicago. He is a product of this migration. So it's interesting how often we've already sort of introduced and talked about some of these things. So be thinking along those lines. Right? Be thinking along those lines, even though we're early in the process. 7 letters to the Chicago Defender, a black newspaper published in Chicago that strongly urged Southern blacks to migrate north, attest to migrants' strong desire to, quote, better their condition, often risking their lives and possessions to make the trip north. I'm going to read this first one from someone in Lutcher, Louisiana, 1917, May. Right, this is right at the end of World War I. It said, "Dear sir, I've been reading the Chicago Defender and seeing so many advertisements about the work in the North. I thought to write you concerning my condition. I am working hard in the South and can hardly earn a living. I have a wife and 1 child and can hardly feed them." All right, first of all, within a sentence or two, you can see this is a male. Right? You sort of see him making the argument almost in terms of manhood. I can't feed my family. I'm a hard worker, but I can't feed my family. This is why I'm going to leave. This is why I need the opportunity. It's really a request for opportunity. Some of these folks are going to be writing in terms of not just race, but gender. Right? Notions of manhood and being able to take care of your family are bound up in this for a lot. Economics is a major theme for a lot of the people leaving. Right? A lot of people talk about looking for work. That's one of the most common themes, in fact. I thought to write you and ask you for some information concerning how to get a pass for myself and my family. I don't want to leave my family behind, as I can't hardly make a living for them right here with them. And I know they would fare hard if I would leave them. So I think this idea of responsibility. He doesn't feel like he can leave them there and even to get work. Right? There may be some other things going on there as well in terms of feeling like his family might be unsafe. If there are any agents in the South, there haven't been any of them to Lutcher. What he's referencing here is the fact that there are labor agents from the North that are going south recruiting people. Like there are literally folks from the factories show up in a train station and say, "Hey, look, we got these good jobs here. I got 50 tickets. Who wants to go?" They're literally recruiting people off the street, and word is getting around about this. What's interesting is he says, look, there haven't been any agents here. Now, maybe he's from a small town. Right? That might be one reason why he hasn't seen any agents. There's going to be another reason why he may not have seen agents, and I'll get to it a little further here. "Please, sir, let me hear as quick as possible." Now, this is all. "Please don't publish my letter." So there's some concerns here. Don't publish my letter. "I was out in town today talking to some of the men, and they say if they could get passes, 30 or 40 of them would come. But they haven't got the money, and they don't know how to come. They are good, strong, and able working men. If you will instruct me, I will instruct the other men how to come, as they all want to work. Please don't publish this, because we have to whisper this around among ourselves. Because the white folks are angry now because the Negroes are going north." As this movement progresses, right, despite the fact folks are being lynched and chased and whatnot, there is a movement to control the labor in the South. These folks are the ones picking the cotton and sharecropping and doing the work, right? So as thousands start to leave, there is a growing hostility towards leaving. So much so that as these labor agents come, and hang out at the train stations, some folks show up with weapons and like, you can't leave. There are some folks that say, no, you're not getting on the train today. Go on back to the farm. literally not allowing people to leave. So he said here twice, don't publish my letter. Don't put my name on it, right? Because this could be bad for me. So, I mean, you sort of get a sense of the complications of this period and literally how folks might be taking their life in their hand to try to leave. This is a pretty common letter in this sense. So there's some others here from men and women that might be slightly different. I'm not going to read them all, but I wanted to point that out, especially in some of the themes that come up in this. This one's writing to, from Natchez, Mississippi, writing to Editor Abbott, editor of the Chicago Defender. Dear sir, I thought you would help me. I thought you might help me in some way, either personally or through your influence. Is why I'm worrying for you, which I beg pardon. And again, levels of education are going to be different here. The writing abilities are going to be different, as you'll notice, and some of that gets mentioned here too. I'm a married man having wife and mother to support. Right, again, within one sentence, right, they've laid out this notion of kind of manhood and responsibility. I mentioned this in order to properly convey my plight. Conditions here are not altogether good, and living expenses growing while wages are small. My greatest desire is to leave for a better place. Right? I can write short stories, all of which portray Negro characters, but no burlesque. I can also write poems, have a gift for cartooning. Right? This guy has a skill. He's a writer. He's trying to find work in the North as a writer, which is not the norm for most folks, but it's interesting that he, first of all, has this gift, and therefore has some level of education at least, and also has a particular sort of skill which he wants to use in the North. Can you use any of my short stories? Well, this means I could probably leave here in short and thus come in possession of better employment, enabling me to take up drawing, which I like best. So he's an artist as well. Kindly let me hear from you. If you cannot favor me, could you refer me to any Negro publication buying fiction from their race? Selma, Alabama, 1917. Dear sir, I'm a reader of the Defender. I think it's one of the most wonderful papers of our race. Sirs, I'm writing to you to see if you all will please get me a job. I can wash dishes, wash and iron, nursing, work in groceries and dry goods. Any of these I can do. They're open. You got any kind of job, I'll do it. It's better than here. When I get there, as I have, I missed the line. Whoever you get the job from, please tell me to send me a ticket, and I will pay them when I get there, as I have not got enough money to pay them. I am a girl of 17 years old in the 8th grade at Knox Academy School. This is a young lady. She's arguing for some of the same themes that the men have been arguing for: economics, a job. Now, some women are going to be writing, and some women are going to be pushed out of the South for other reasons as well. But this particular lady is articulating some of the same themes we saw with the men. Oh, thank you all, my heart. And you see her age, she's 17 in the 8th grade. So she obviously hasn't gone straight through school, probably has worked, probably has gone to school on and off, which is going to be the case for many folks at this time, particularly in the South at this moment. Let's see if there's one more I want to look at. I don't know if I necessarily need to go through these. I think you can probably go through them on your own. Gives you some sense, at least, of the possibilities in terms of these letters. And you sort of see what historians do, even in terms of sort of thinking about the context as these folks are writing. In terms of the handout, again, there's a lot of information on here. We didn't read through it all last time, but I pointed out certain things. Some of them that I pointed out last time were these themes that I wanted you to think of as people are considering migration. Right? Economics, obviously, is one that comes up. Housing is going to be an issue. Educational opportunities. Some of these letters talk about, I want my kids to go to school. That's why I want to migrate in addition to work. Right? So think about the themes that come out of this discussion and what one or two themes you see as most important as you're making your argument. Yes, sir.
Can we have, do you just write about, one main character? Can we have a main character for, more than one theme? Do we have to write about one theme?
Yeah, well, you can use one main character. What I don't want you to do is think you have to just write about the character, right? The character is kind of your inlet into your argument, right? They help you make your arguments. And people's styles are different. Some people may start off with a quote from their main character, right? And then talk about how it illustrates certain themes about the migration. Some of you may refer to your character several different times. Don't feel like you have to write the whole character's story, right? The character is there to help you make your argument about whether the migration is good or bad, and the main themes you see is operating in the particular stream you're looking for. So they're kind of your ammunition, right, for your argument, not the other way around. You don't even have to agree with them. Right? They're arguing for economic opportunity. You may say, look, there wasn't that much opportunity, right? But this is all information and evidence for you, examples for you to make your argument about the migration more generally. So think of it that way. So yeah, you can refer to more than one character if you want, or just one character, or what have you. This is the way to be specific, because I'm trying to push you to be specific, because you'll notice that you're not going to have time and space to really deal with more than maybe two of these big themes in any detail, right, in terms of your argument. And you don't have to talk about everything. It's about making your argument in the time and the space allowed. That make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
All this stuff is your evidence, right? I talked about the outline here and the tentative deadlines. In terms of the outline, right? Introduction. Your introduction will be essentially you're contextualizing the argument. Tell me something about the Great Migration. So you'll tell me in terms of how many people are moving, or what particular immigration stream you want to look at. Something about your main character, perhaps. So think in terms of, again, who, what, when, where. Right? This is sort of the contextualization. This is setting up your argument. Your thesis is the why and the how. Your thesis, the beginning of your thesis, is the answer to this question as to whether you think the Great Migration is beneficial or detrimental. Right? A thesis is always really an answer to a research question. Scientists, when they go into a chemistry lab, right, they have certain questions in their mind. Right? And this is where historians get their methods from, the scientific method. Right? The scientist, chemist may go into the lab and say, okay, I think if I mix sulfur and iodine, it's going to blow up. Right? I don't know. I'm not good at chemistry, obviously. But they go in there and they say, I have to test it. Right? Go in there and test it. Didn't blow up. Okay, I have to change my hypothesis. Right? Something has to change if you test it and it comes out differently than you expected. But you start with questions. Right? You're starting with the question of whether the migration is beneficial or not. And then you'll test it looking at these examples, these characters, these analyses of the migration itself, and decide what you think about that. Then use examples and evidence to support your argument. I don't grade you on your opinion. Whether you think it's beneficial, detrimental, is not really of my concern. How well do you explain it? How well do you support it? That's how you're evaluated. So your thesis, the why and the how, right? Your answer to the question of whether or not the Great Migration, you probably can't see this, but you have that handout as well, was beneficial or detrimental. Why do you believe this? And how do you plan to specifically demonstrate it in this paper? I'm pushing you to be specific. So you may introduce your main character here. The character from Lucha, Louisiana was looking for employment, blah, 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 blah. That tells your reader exactly what you think you might argue. Maybe the one or two themes you see as most important. Pushing you to be specific early on. Because if you tell me why you're arguing what you argue, and then how you're going to lay it out in this paper, the paper essentially writes itself at that point. All you got to do is do it. Tell me about the themes, tell me about the character. That's it. So starting correctly will help you end correctly. Obviously, the majority of the information is in this body section, which I'll talk about more. This is where you'll make your analysis. I also want you to tell me something in this body section about your sources. What sources do you choose? What do they tell you? What you're really doing is kind of marrying multiple sources. Visual sources and videos that we see. Letters like this, primary sources, something from the textbook. You put all those, this is what historians do, put them all together and come up with your interpretation of things. Think about this class and how I present this information to you all. We started with two non-historians, Imagine Community and Tipping Point. We've used that all semester to try to analyze the history that we're looking at. Right? That's just my approach. We didn't have to do it that way. But that's just the way we approach it because you're a teacher. Somebody else might have chosen something else to start off. So essentially what you're doing here is doing history. Right? You're essentially doing history. But in this body section, I want you to tell me something about your sources as well. Obviously, the choice of sources is up to you. Mention the theme of gender. How does manhood and womanhood come up, for example, in your reading of The Great Migration? Does it come up in your main character? I don't want you just to think about race. I want you to think broadly. Race, class, gender may come up in this. Education may come up in this. Any number of themes. Which two or three do you see as most significant? In the conclusion is going to be fairly brief, but I want you to think about what comes out of this. What are some of the outcomes of this migration? There are going to be many. Some historians argue that you couldn't have had a Harlem Renaissance without thousands of people moving to Harlem in this period. Some argue that you couldn't have had a civil rights movement without millions of people ultimately getting out of the South, concentrating in cities, becoming a kind of political force there. So a lot of folks argue that it changes the entire country. Some argue that you wouldn't have had the explosion of jazz. You wouldn't have had any number of things from the 20s onward. So again, you can think just briefly about what some of the outcomes of this movement might be. And restate your thesis, obviously. And you'll do a bibliography. You'll tell me what sources you ended up choosing. I want you to have a minimum of 6 to 8 sources total. That should not be difficult based on the amount of stuff available to you on the Blackboard and the textbook by itself. But 6 to 8 sources, because I want you to balance these sources. I want you to put them together and see what you come up with. Does that make sense? Where we are right now is I want you to be thinking about a possible thesis. I want you to take a look at these sources available to you in the Great Migration Project folder, which is in the week 9 and 10. Take a look at those pages in the textbook where they talk about the Great Migration, and think about that question. Do you think this is going to be ultimately beneficial or detrimental? Now, your thesis may change, but I'm asking you to turn a thesis in by Monday night, but it may change. That's fine. This is a working thesis at this point. It may develop. You may think you're arguing in this, and you end up arguing something different. But this will help you get started. 1 or 2 sentences is all I'm asking. And I'm not even asking you to have your whole introduction laid out. I want you to lay out a specific thesis. This material will be helpful for you. This is a sort of brief summary of the Great Migration. It says Great Migration Brief Summary. It's a Word document. There's an outline here with statistics and sort of readings of the migration more generally. A lot of sort of big picture, right, between 1910 and 1970, an estimated 6 million African Americans left. So those kinds of that kind of information is available to you on Blackboard. I wanted to make this so that you don't have to really go outside and you don't have to go to the library and do a bunch of running around town trying to complete this project. That make sense?
Yes.
Okay, good. In terms of the visual sources here, there's a folder, Great Migration Videos. I'm going to show you about 10 minutes of this one, which starts off talking about the Great Migration. It ends by talking about things like the Harlem Renaissance and some of the things that they argue came out of this migration. But in terms of what we're looking at, this one is from a series, and it starts off literally with the impact of the Great Migration. I want to continue to give you possible main characters to think about, possible sources, possible interpretations of this movement to impact your opinion of whether you think this is ultimately a good or a bad thing. Again, what you should be thinking about and working on is this thesis statement. How do you think you may answer this question of whether it's going to be a good or a bad thing ultimately? How do you think you may approach this project? Okay, so we'll play a few minutes of this to give you more of a sense of that, and I'll make a quick announcement at the end before we leave.
The dawning of the 20th century brought cruel repression to the African American people. But the strategies they employed to fight back led to profound transformations in American society. As Black people